KZSU-FM Stanford, welcome to another edition of Hearsay Culture. My name is Dave Levine. I'm a professor at Elon University School of Law, as well as an affiliate scholar at the Center for Internet and Society at Stanford Law School. Today, I'm very excited to have on the authors of the new book, Choke Point Capitalism: How Big Tech and Big Content Captured Creative Markets and How We'll Win Them Back, which was released just a couple of days ago. The authors are Rebecca Giblin and Cory Doctorow. Hearsay Culture has been on for over 15 years now, and from the very beginning, I think one of the first interviews I did was with Larry Lessig, followed by Richard Epstein, who focused on the very issues that yet plague us these many years later. How is it that we can simultaneously create the kind of world we want on the internet without, as the authors point out, choking all but a few players from being able to do it? This is an age-old problem with technology, and it's one that we're going to explore today with this very timely, although sadly very familiar scenario, which is how we allow competition, but let's not call it competition. Let's call it creativity to flourish in technology. We've got a scenario today in 2022, folks, that all of us know pretty well. I challenge you to consider whether you could, for example, abandon Amazon as a place to buy things and put aside COVID for a moment and just think about it in terms of convenience. When you listen to music, there are only a few popular music venues, basically, that share, starting with Spotify, streaming, and the big labels, which are now down to about 3. Even 15 or 16 years ago, we saw competition flourishing that no longer seems to exist. And as we're going to be talking about later in this interview, one near and dear to the hearts of anyone who's listening to this show, not on KZSU, podcasting appears to be one of the last venues where we don't see the kinds of consolidation and challenges that we see elsewhere. Although, as the authors point out, that might be changing as well. Even though I am a law professor, and in fact, Rebecca is one as well, I'm going to eschew going into the weeds of law and to discuss this more broadly from the perspective of what consumers might think about these issues, and perhaps more importantly, what consumers could do about that through a book that is more or less divided in 2 parts. Part 1, identifying the problems and why they might exist, and the authors defending, and we'll talk about the notion that there are choke points within these various markets that prevent the kinds of creativity that we'd like. And then the second part of the book runs through a number of solutions, some familiar, some not as much. Throughout, I'm going to be, and we're going to be discussing what might be done about this. By way of very brief background, because these are both folks that are well known to the Hearsay Culture audience, Rebecca is an ARC Future Fellow and professor at Melbourne Law School. Having spent some time in Melbourne, I know I'm supposed to say Melbourne, but I'm a New Yorker and I don't like trying to pull that off. Let's say Melbourne, but it's really something like Melbourne. And director of the Intellectual Property Research Institute of Australia. Rebecca has authored many articles, several books, and is, again, well known particularly in the intellectual property and technology space. Cory Doctorow, many of you I'm sure also know, is a best-selling fiction writer and an activist. He's a professor. He's a special advisor to the Electronic Frontier Foundation, EFF, an MIT Media Lab research affiliate, and co-founder of the UK Open Rights Group, and co-owner, and this is perhaps what he's best known for, at least among people who pay attention to technology news, co-owner of the website Boing Boing. They are joining us together, and I should have asked pre-interview where you are generally, not an address, of course, for privacy reasons, but you are together, which is cool. And where are you right now, Cory and Rebecca?
We're in my luxury bunker in New Zealand where we're hiding out with Peter Thiel. No, we're in my garage in Burbank.
I was going to say
this is my home office.
Excellent. If that was true, I would have to go directly in that direction. We're recording on September 28th. Rebecca and Cory, thank you so much for joining us on Hearsay Culture.
Thanks for having us.
So let me start off. I mean, I kind of laid the groundwork, but choke point capitalism is certainly a catchy name. I'd be remiss if I didn't ask, starting off, what exactly the choke point is to which you refer.
This was something that we noticed. It actually was quite late on in the writing process that we kind of finally realized that all of these different creative industries that we'd been talking about, that we'd been analyzing and showing that, everywhere we were seeing examples of big business using their power to lock in customers and then lock in suppliers, use that power to help them eliminate competition, and then ultimately shake down creators and workers as much as they could, that it was all essentially the same playbook. That, say what you will about capitalism, but if you have it, central to it is supposed to be competition, right? This free flow between buyers and sellers. But what we were seeing in each of these industries that we had looked at is that these companies had deliberately set out to create these choke points, to make these hourglass shaped markets that had audiences at one side, creators at the other, and themselves mediating access, squeezing at the neck. And that's what allows them to shake down creators, and that's why creative laborers share so little in the rewards of creative labor.
Cory, Rebecca used the term shakedown, which of course is a loaded term. But then again, your book is fairly activist in its tone. When we talk about shakedown, what do we mean in the context of the broader markets that we're talking about here?
Well, there's a theory that says that prices are the result of like market dynamics. They're bids and puts, how much people are willing to sell for and how much they're willing to buy for. But there's another theory, I think that's much more in touch with the reality as it exists, which is that prices are the result of power, right? It's if someone has something and they can stop you from getting it somewhere else and you really need it, they can set prices. And audiences are really important to creators, both for our commercial lives, but also for our artistic satisfaction. Creators are as a laboring class particularly vulnerable to being squeezed because famously artists make art even when there's no rational economic basis for doing so. There's that old joke about the kid who runs away and joins the circus and his dad finds him shoveling elephant poop, and he says, "Son, come home," and the kid hefts his shovel and says, "What, and quit show business?" The history is littered with people, artists of great talent and of very little talent, but great ambition, who have accepted materially unfair economic arrangements in service to reaching their audience. I won't claim that as a class that creators are unique here. I think that there are lots of other professions where you have similar dynamics for various reasons, where people feel a sense of mission. It's very present in things like daycare workers, teachers, nurses, and you see the same kind of vulnerability where employers are relatively confident that even if they abuse their employees, that their employees will still show up for work out of a sense of duty to the mission. In Toronto, where I'm from, we had a great and brilliant free weekly called Now Magazine that was our equivalent to, say, the Village Voice. And Now Magazine passed through a series of hands, ended up in the hands of some half-witted cannabis magnates who thought that it would be a way to sell pot. It didn't work. They just stopped paying people, and yet they put out months more issues. And when the final issue came out, the editor, who himself had not been paid, announced on Twitter that this was the final issue and that no one on staff had been paid in months, and that this would be their final issue, and they were proud to have put it out together. They're like the orchestra playing off the passengers on the deck of the Titanic, right? It's their duty.
This is, as I mentioned in the intro, while that, assuming we agree with the critique and we'll talk about it, this isn't a new problem, right? I mean, Lessig in his talks 20 years ago, right, in critique of copyright online, spoke about how the Constitution and copyright was baked in to support not creators, but publishers, right? The platforms of 200 plus years ago. What makes the problem, if it is, different today?
Well, I think that in Lessig's era, there was the hope that there was some countervailing force in the form of the tech companies, that they were relatively disorganized. I mean, 20 years ago, I remember waking up one day and finding out that a completely bonkers copyright intermediary liability bill that had no legs because it was a state law had been introduced in something like 30 state legislatures all at once, because the entertainment industry was super consolidated. They had excess rents from being so consolidated, and they had low coordination costs. And the tech industry was running around, like headless chickens trying to do something about it. They didn't have lobbyists in the state houses. They were too busy being at each other's throats. And so there was the sense that maybe we could play the tech companies off against each other, and that we could use them to get better deals. If YouTube wouldn't give you a good deal, you could threaten to go to Vimeo, and if Vimeo wouldn't do you a good deal, maybe you could go P2P and just use an ad broker, and so on and so on. And the final scene of Animal Farm is a good indicator of what happened here. And this is a spoiler alert for those of you who haven't read 70-year-old George Orwell novels that are parables for the Russian Revolution. But in the final scene of Animal Farm,
time to read it though, so we can be clear.
Yeah, the pigs who led the revolution throw their lot in with the men who were their revolutionary enemies, and the animals who they betray go to the farmhouse to see the pigs dining with the men. And the last line is they look from the men to the pigs and the pigs to the men, and they cannot tell the difference. Eventually, the tech sector became as consolidated as, and then as hostile to labor as, the entertainment sector.
And that's a natural consequence of, 40, 50 years of an approach to antitrust law in this country that has been not just a tolerance of monopoly, but an encouragement of monopoly. For example, with policies that prohibit, smaller, weaker companies from getting together to talk about how they can get some countervailing power against giants like Amazon. But what you can do is that you can merge with one another, right? As Cory was saying somewhere else earlier, if you've got the president of Penguin, the president of Random House, and the president of Simon Schuster all in a room together, they're not allowed to talk about their coordinated strategy. Sorry, the CEOs. They're not allowed to talk about a coordinated strategy for dealing with this, enormously powerful giant. But if Random House buys Penguin and buys Simon and Schuster, then absolutely, then the heads of each division can get together in the boardroom and do exactly that. So the way that antitrust law has been set up has deeply encouraged consolidation, and the end result, like 20 years now later on from where Lessig was talking, is that we are seeing the consequences of that playing out. We've got giants in nearly every field that are dominating their markets and using that power to, like I said, shake down everybody else.
We're chatting with Rebecca Gibleman and Cory Doctorow, authors of the book that has just come out, Choke Point Capitalism, published literally a couple of days ago. So you can find it from Beacon.
Yesterday.
Yeah. Yeah, there we go. So eagle-eyed listeners will notice, Rebecca, that your accent does not sound American. Cory's closer geographically as a Canadian, but those that pay attention would pick that up. And yet when you said this country, and I want to be clear about this, you're talking about the United States. Now, it might be obvious.
Garage in Burbank.
Yeah, there we go. Now, it might be obvious to people that pay attention to this why, but just to be clear, why not write about Australia or Canada or international law or the EU? Why is it the US, which is the sole focus with very limited exception in your book?
Well, I would say that we look to those other countries in terms of inspiration for some of the solutions, which I guess we'll talk about later in this interview. But it's that those US policies around antitrust in particular that have allowed those entertainment and tech companies to accrue such power. And then they use that, they export that power around the world. So a creator in Australia or the UK or Mongolia who wants to get their videos out into the world, right? They're almost always having to do it with YouTube because that's where the audience is, right? And the same thing, if you're a writer, there are certainly plenty of countries where Amazon doesn't have dominance, but where it does, you've got really no choice but to go through it. And so those American policies have had direct follow-through consequences in different markets for the entire world.
And it should be said that the American kind of neoliberal economic establishment exported its wisdom around the world, its dubious wisdom around the world, and those theories have been embraced. I mean, Canada has some advantages to the US in terms of its art policy in the form of direct support for the arts and quotas for Canadian content and so on. But its economic orthodoxy around mergers and acquisitions is, if anything, even more laissez-faire than in the US. Our competition bureau has been asleep at the switch to the point where you have, single billionaires who own all the ISPs and all the TV stations and all the radio stations and all the cable networks and all the magazines and the newspapers. And it's just sort of one company. It's like that scene in that old Simpsons episode where they visit the Duff brewery, and there's like Duff Framboise and Duff Bock and Duff Light and Duff Ultra, and it's all like one pipe with 4 outflows that are going into the 4 vats, right? It's all just Ted Rogers and whatever wild hair he gets this week that is the source of nearly all Canadian media policy.
Let's use so that we move from policy to a concrete example. All three of us now have alluded to Amazon, and for obvious reasons, because of their market dominance, you spend a fair amount of time on Amazon. Explain to the listener how Amazon goes, and you explain the story in the book, right? How it goes from being unable to ship 10 books, right, to dominating literally virtually all online sales, to the point that you really, in most instances, have to make a concerted effort to decide, I am not going to buy from Amazon.
I love that story. I'd forgotten about it until you mentioned it, but that's right. When they were first starting out and they were really scrambling, didn't have a ton of capital, they actually began the company with a con. So they had this practice that they were selling books. They had very little volume. So they'd get an order in, and they just needed to send out one book. But the wholesalers had a 10-book minimum, and so they figured out, well, if we order that one book we actually want and 9 copies of some obscure out of print thing on lichens, then the wholesaler will send it to us anyway, and like we don't have to pay for postage. And so they were stealing other people's margins from the get-go.
Yeah.
But yeah, it was
not that there's anything wrong with lichens, by the way. I just want to be clear about that as the host. But yeah,
sure.
Big lichen fan here as well.
Yeah.
But
so my best friends are deer.
But we can understand this when we look at what Amazon calls its virtuous cycle, its flywheel, right? And if you Google Amazon's flywheel, or you look at our book, you can see what this looks like. And the way they talk about it is they say, well, we have got this lower cost structure, and from stealing other people's margins, we've got this lower cost structure that leads to attracts more customers, which attracts more sellers, which means there's a better customer experience, there's more goods on offer, and so this cycle kind of keeps continuing. So they call it this virtuous cycle. But what we show is that what's actually happening is that this is far from virtuous, it's anti-competitive. Amazon's playbook has always been to lock in its users, right? And it does that in a whole bunch of different ways. We can see that in particular with Amazon Prime. It may very well feel like it's against your self-interest to not have Prime. Look at what a deal it is. For that low upfront fee, you get your fast free shipping year round. You get easy ways to return your packages by just wandering over to Whole Foods, where you also get discounts on your groceries. You get video, you get book rentals. There's so much that they give you, and it seems wonderful, right? But the reason that they're giving it to you is to lock you in so that you go to Amazon instead of anywhere else. And when you do that, that means that the sellers have got no choice except to be there as well, because they cannot afford to give up the share of the market that is represented by that company. Then with the profits that they manage to extract through these lock-ins, they eliminate competitors so that there's even less choice. And in fact, we know that venture capitalists will refuse to invest in startups that are going to enter into Amazon's territory, because they know exactly what's going to happen. It's going to be scorched earth, like the time that Amazon spent, I think it was $200 million in a month to squeeze diapers.com out of the market. And then once they've done all of these things, then they can turn that wheel, they can ratchet that flywheel like ever tighter, squeeze, shake down their workers and suppliers, the creators that supply the content that the company is built on, so that their share is just unsustainably and unfairly low, and nobody's then got any choice.
You talk about, and I want to explain a couple of these terms, or ask you to do so, because I think they're important to your critique. You refer to moats, right? You use the medieval example of the moat, and you refer to Amazon as the king of moats, or something along those lines. What is a moat, or what is the image of the moat in the context of what we're talking about here?
Yeah, the moats and walls terminology, I believe, comes from everyone's favorite cuddly billionaire, Warren Buffett.
There we go.
An avowed monopolist who says that he only likes investing in sectors where there is no competition. And it's telling that he refused to invest in Amazon when it started, but later on, once they had established their business, he said, "Oh no, this is a firm without any meaningful competition. I will invest in them." So Rebecca mentioned that at the start, Amazon had this flywheel where they had this lower cost basis, which they used to rope in customers, which they used to extract concessions from vendors, which lowered their cost basis further. But it kind of raises this question: how did they have a lower cost basis at the beginning before they had all these customers locked in that they could use to extract concessions? And the answer is they went to the capital markets and they said, "We'll just lose money on every sale." Well, and this will be familiar to anyone who's ever ridden in an Uber. For the first whatever decade or so, the Saudi royal family spent tens of billions of dollars, so that 41 cents out of every dollar that Uber made was a loss that was made up out of the Saudi oil billions, and that was a way to systematically undermine investment in public transit, to force other transportation companies out of business, and establish a kind of lock-in of a different sort in cities all around the world. And now we see Amazon ratcheting down their drivers and ratcheting up the prices, or Uber rather, ratcheting down the compensation for their drivers and ratcheting up the payments for their or the costs for their riders. And this is a capital moat, right? If starting a firm requires that you be able to mobilize enough capital to beat the incumbent in a race to see who can subsidize the product the most, then whoever has the biggest war chest gets the market. And so instead of having a regulator structure the market, you have whoever won the last round in the kind of market game, who's got the war chest left over from that victory, they get to make that victory permanent, and they get to mobilize that capital over and over again. This was very much the animating principles behind early antitrust law. And it really, and I know you said you didn't want to get into the weeds of law, but we can't talk about this without talking about the fact that in the early 1980s, Ronald Reagan, had a kind of pet economic theorist in the form of Robert Bork, and who took on board this idea that we should just allow anti-competitive conduct because it should be presumed to be efficient. Otherwise, businesses wouldn't do it. And only when you could show that it was inefficient and led to higher prices, and not just higher prices on their own, but higher prices that could be directly causally linked to monopoly, that you should enforce. And, that's a policy that every firm since has taken on board. We're talking on a radio station here. The Clinton administration signed the Telecommunications Act that opened up ownership of multiple radio stations, newspapers, and TV stations in the same market, and that allowed the same kind of squeezing. This was a bipartisan consensus for 4 decades, and it's only now in the Biden administration that we see, through personnel being policy, Tim Wu and Lena Khan and Jonathan Cantor at the White House, the FTC and the DOJ, actually starting to reverse some of that economic orthodoxy and challenge the idea that just because a firm is big, it's good, and that if it's good, it must be big.
We're chatting with Rebecca Giblin and Cory Doctorow, authors of the new book, Choke Point Capitalism, on KZSU-FM, Stanford, and Hearsay Culture. So one last, although you're getting into your critique, definitional term, which we referred to at the beginning, has been mentioned, is this idea of the hourglass-shaped market. Now, I think this gets to the core of the choke point, and we can all envision, hopefully, what an hourglass looks like. But what is this hourglass? In other words, what's in each, right, top and bottom? I think we know what the middle is, right? The middle would be Amazon or the others. But on other ends, I assume, and I want to make sure we're clear, are the creators on one end and the consumers on the other, or is it not that simple?
No, that's it.
That
sums it up.
And when you scale it out to, we zoom out, and we're not just focused on creative labor markets. You've got, consumers on one side and usually workers and suppliers at the other.
Right. So let me ask one point, which kind of, and then we're going to take a short break, and then we'll come right back. One interesting critique in your book, and I have my dog-eared and flagged copy in front of me. There's been a lot of discussion over the last 20 plus years, right, about businesses, right, or industries being a problem, right? Some industries, and I'm using that term advisedly, right, are doing better than others because it's the technology that's better, or it's the people that's in it that are better. But you make an interesting point, which I think we should dive into here, where you say that the problem is not, the problem being what we're talking about, lies not in the type of business, but in the ability to create hourglass-shaped markets with customers paying money on one end, suppliers and workers creating value at the others. What is it, therefore, right, if that's true, that causes people, right, to create these hourglass shaped markets? I think we know, we might say money, right? But then secondly, what are the conditions that allow it to happen? Now, we talked about some of them, and you get into this in the first half of the book. So I recognize this will take a few minutes, but what are the conditions that allow this to happen, right? That allows, therefore, the hourglass market to exist in virtually all creative fields, not to mention in commerce generally on the internet.
Well, look, what we see in the book is that there are all different tools kind of used to achieve this. Like we know, Warren Buffett talking about, salivating over these wide, unbreachable moats. Peter Thiel saying competition is for losers. We know what's the orthodoxy taught in business schools now is to do exactly this, right? But they use all different tools to achieve it. So in terms of Amazon, we talked about Prime as a moat, but also digital rights management or DRM on the ebooks and audiobooks, which stop people from just up and taking their libraries to another provider. So it means that you're not staying there because it's the best product at the best price, but you're staying there because you're locked in other ways. But we also see, a wide variety of other tools that are being used. In the case of the big three record labels, which control almost 70% of the global recorded music industry, music rights. They use the fact that they took copyrights for the entire term, which allows them to control the future of music in a way that they wouldn't be able to if those contracts were shorter. Right, so they also own the big three music publishers, who between them control almost 60% of the global song rights in music, which is really like an extraordinary thing when you say it out loud. And that allows them, gives them further control over this market. And we see it as well with Spotify, in the way in which it's increasingly relying on playlists. It doesn't have us locked in the same way that some of these other companies do. But what you can see when they're like pushing these playlists to us, and encouraging us to not choose the particular artist we want to listen to, but like just in the particular flavor. Are you looking for some chill ambiance piano? Are you looking for some like the hottest new rap? Right, what they're getting us to do there is outsource to them the decisions about what goes into our ears. And once we've done that, once we are completely acclimated to that, then it's not the artists who have the power to attract you. It's Spotify who gets to decide which artists you listen to, which gives them the power. And we're seeing that start to play out in terms of the fees, or really it's a discounted royalty rate that they're offering artists in order to have greater chance of exposure, greater chance of being included in these playlists and so on, that is providing the conditions for these choke points too. So there's all different ways in which they're doing it, and it's the like we talked about, this tolerance of monopoly that allows them to. But also it's a fact there's something going on here that's not very well understood, and it's to do with another term, which is monopsony, which is hideously unattractive. People don't find this word appealing at all, and we were told to take it out of the book a whole bunch.
It's also hard to pronounce.
It's hard to pronounce, right?
It's easier than oligopsony, though.
Yeah,
Which
no,
is
that's better.
technically
Okay.
what we are talking about, but even we draw the line at that. And what that is, we all know monopoly because like there's a board game for that. It's where you've got a seller who's got a lot of power over buyers. So Amazon in basically every market for consumer goods, right? You kind of need to go through Amazon in many cases because you don't know where else to find that thing, or it's going to take too long to find that thing, or you've got the free shipping for that thing. But they've also got a monopsony, which is where a buyer is very powerful and the buyer has power over sellers. And so Amazon also has that in many different fields, including in publishing. It's very obvious. If you're a publisher, right, you cannot survive, with very rare exceptions in this country and the other countries where Amazon has dominance. You can't survive without going through them, because if you give up access to Amazon's customers, right, you have no other alternative for selling those books. And there are some things about monopsony that make it much more dangerous and difficult to deal with than monopoly, including the fact that it arises at way lower market concentrations. So 10% can give a company like a lot of power over the sellers that are trying to get their goods to market. And so when you when you combine that like relatively low concentrations with the ways in which they're constructing these choke points to lock sellers of creative works into the markets, you see like very quickly how we ended up in this situation.
Yeah, and I want to say that I think that it's a mistake to assume that the monopolists and monopsonists of today have some special wickedness in their heart and that their predecessors were more virtuous. There may be something to that, only to the extent that, as we talked about with Amazon and the publishers, once one part of a supply chain becomes monopolized, the other parts of the supply chain monopolize defensively. And, you know, ultimately, the two parts of the supply chain that can't monopolize are the customers and the workers, which is how you end up with, you know, monopoly in the pharma sector, which begets gouging of the hospital sector, which begets monopoly in the hospital sector, which begets gouging of the insurance sector, which begets monopoly in insurance. And now we have patients and doctors, patients paying more for worse care and doctors being paid less for worse conditions. And everyone in between is just sort of fighting among themselves to shuffle the gains that they're extracting from the loose flapping ends at either end of it. But I think that when you give firms the power to decide who can compete with them and how, that they will avail themselves of that power. And it would be naive to assume otherwise. So, you know, in California, non-competes are not enforceable because of our state constitution. And in other states,
Hello? Are you there?
I am. We are.
You
Can
went,
you hear us okay?
that's okay. You went completely red and then disappeared. So
I have monopoly internet service. Anyway, so just to finish that thought. Okay, go ahead. Go ahead.
I stopped the recording. So what I'm going to do, I kept the video going and I can deal with it later. What I'm going to do is 3, 2, 1, and then I'll just go right back to your answer and I'll edit it afterwards. Okay?
Sure, of course.
That's okay. All right. 3, 2, 1.
So here in California, non-competes are non-enforceables because of our state constitution, and in other states they are. And we have firms that operate in both states. And in California, they don't use non-competes, and in other states they do, which tells you that the constraint on them is not the ethical center that says that if you're a cashier at a Wendy's, you should be allowed to go work at a KFC, but rather the fact that the state in California doesn't allow you to impose that condition on your cashier at Wendy's. And in other states it does. And of course, in other states, the leading group of workers who sign non-competes are fast food workers.
Yeah. And it's, and the without getting too far in the weeds there, the non-compete story is complicated in California because while the law says it, the courts have slowly chipped away and said, well, we can kind of do this and kind of do that. But as a policy matter, right, well, what California says they're doing, which is kind of part of your critique, what we say is not necessarily what we do.
But you're getting at something really important there, which is that these court battles that chip away at the law are very expensive. Mm-hmm. And that they are, and that and other forms of kind of regulatory entrepreneurship, whether that's regulatory capture and lobbying or astroturfing or any of those other things that firms do to try to create favorable regulatory environments, are epiphenomena of monopoly, right? Because if there's 100 of you at each other's throats, you don't have any money left over to go and suborn the judicial and political process. If there's like 4 of you in a cozy arrangement who've divided up the country the way the Pope divided up the New World, and you don't have to compete with each other, if you're the cable industry, say, then you've got lots of leftover rent that you can spend on corrupting the political process.
We're chatting with Rebecca Giblin and Cory Doctorow on KZSU-FM Stanford and Hearsay Culture, authors of the book Choke Point Capitalism. Yeah, I want to come back to something here for clarity purposes, right? As we get into the solutions, and we have about a little bit less than 20 minutes left, as we get into solutions, I can imagine listeners listening to this and saying, well, you know what? These authors are very concerned about producers, the creators, right? And sure, we should help them. But as a consumer, I'm doing great, right? I'm able to pick from 15 different table covers. For those of us that are listening on Friday, you might be dealing with a hurricane directly. It's heading my way towards North Carolina. I can pick 15 different covers for my outdoor table that I would never be able to pick from. I'd be lucky to find one. And by the way, the prices are great. And why not allow Spotify to make these choices, in the sense that I'm busy, I don't have time for this. I'm very happy to choose those choices. Why not? Or how would you respond to saying, you know what? The problem is really that we're not being nice enough to content creators, but for consumers, this is a great deal. Consolidate away.
Well, the thing is, though, we are, we might be consumers, but nearly all of us are also workers, and we are on the other side of this as well.
Okay.
And what we're seeing is that as corporate concentration increases, workers are being squeezed in all different kinds of fields, and that's having huge demonstrable downward pressure on wages. And that means that even if you can get your tablecloths pretty cheaply on Amazon, the fact that your wages are being suppressed has the same end result as prices going up at the other end, is that you're less and less able to afford the goods and services that you need to live your life. Mm-hmm. And so it's a little bit like it's a magic trick, right? They're just like, look over there, look how great everything is, but just ignore what's happening over here, because our hand has just slid into your pocket and pulled out yet more money.
And I would say also that, the premise that if you like Amazon, if you like the convenience of Amazon, you can't also decry its labor practices or its economic practices, or the way that it pollutes, or the way that it puts people to risk with its van fleets or whatever. It is Amazon's premise, right? Amazon wants you to think that these things can never be separated, that you can't get one without the other. And this is what Google tells us, right? Google tells us, well, if you want a search engine, you have to take surveillance. And the thing is, we know that's not true because Google used to not spy on you, right? That they had a great search engine before they started spying on you. So did Facebook. Facebook used to bill itself as the privacy forward alternative to MySpace. And so if the argument is that you can only have Facebook if you take the surveillance, you only have Amazon if you take the monopoly, is their idea. And I think that you're absolutely right if you say, I like having Spotify and the convenience of Spotify. Mm-hmm. So do I, right? Just like I have a car and it's under warranty, and I like being able to take it to the dealer to get it fixed. But it's not the same thing to say that I like my warranty at the dealer and being able to go there and get it fixed, as to say I want it to be illegal for someone else to fix my car. I can like both of those things at the same time. In fact, I can understand that if I want my dealer to do a good job fixing my car, and not, for example, say, oh, we've looked at it, as Apple does with its phones, we've looked at it and we've decided it's beyond repair, it's just time to buy a new one, which is what Apple does in states where it's harder to fix an iPhone. And instead, they had to contend with independent repairers who might say, you know what, don't buy that new car or that new iPhone, take it to us and we'll fix it and keep it on the road. That it would discipline the firms that we do like, the firms that we do find convenient. Lots of people woke up this morning and said, I'm glad that there's an easy way to order something on Amazon. But no one woke up and said, I wish there was no way to buy things except on Amazon.
Yeah. Yeah. And I think that, and which gets to, and in the remaining time we have, I do want to talk to you about some of the solutions. There's nothing more annoying than reading a book that says, here's a problem and it's a mess and it's terrible. And then the book's done, you're like, well, now what do I do?
Now go vote harder.
Right. Exactly. And we should mention, there is a role for government here, although the question is whether government would do anything and who we're electing. But I want to focus on two particular solutions. You run through several, you've alluded to there's some issues or suggestions you have with regard to limiting the length or duration of copyright contracts, right? Things like minimum wages for creators, which I think are interesting, but they're more familiar solutions. There's two that come up here that I think are particularly interesting that I want to dive into. One is transparency, and the other one is interoperability. And let me start with interoperability words. Speaking of words that your editors may not want you to use, and that maybe I shouldn't use on KZSU, but I'm going to go so far as to use it. When we talk about interoperability as a general matter, right, we're talking about the ability of one technology or one computer to talk to another computer and interact with another computer without getting permission and without having to sign contracts and whatever else. And that is the basis, at least theoretically, of internet architecture. My big question here before we get to interoperability is one that kept running through my head as I was reading your book, which is the real problem here is control of the architecture, right? by, as you alluded to already, right, the people that most benefit from it, which is an age-old problem going to the time of beginning of governments, right? And so I'm curious if you would go so far as to say that the problem here is an architectural one. The problem was the internet is built to create or to allow this kind of consolidation. And so therefore, the problem is the internet.
Yeah, I don't think that's right. I think that we have to decompose interoperability into some subcategories to understand why. So on the one hand, there are these formal interoperable systems, right? So that would be things like if you're going to build a car, you have legal requirements about some standards you have to adopt, or if you're going to build a house, you have some standards you have to adopt. Those standards are arrived at through some process. Sometimes it's like an inter-industry body, sometimes it's NIST or some agency, but there's a formal way to do it. And that is a kind of cooperative interoperability, and sometimes it's a mandatory interoperability. Cooperative interoperability that's not mandatory is stuff like if you want to send a request over the web, you use HTTP to do it. You could send a request using something else, and if someone else knew how to read that request, they might answer it. But you're going to use HTTP because everybody else uses HTTP. There's just a kind of network effect there. Everybody likes to use it. But then there's another kind of interoperability that has a long and very honorable history in the tech world. And that's something that at the Electronic Frontier Foundation, we call adversarial interoperability. But because no one can pronounce that, and because AI was already taken, we call it competitive compatibility, or COMCOM. And COMCOM is all the stuff that you do when the person you want to interoperate doesn't want to cooperate. Right. So that's reverse engineering, bots, scraping, and it's just part of the internet. It's been there forever. You know, when Microsoft refused to make a good version of Office for the Mac and people were throwing away their Macs and just going all Windows, Steve Jobs just had some technologists reverse engineer the Office file formats, and they made iWork Suite with pages and numbers in Keynote, and they read and write Word and Excel and PowerPoint. Just works behind the scenes. That was adversarial. In the same way, when Google started, it showed up at every website on the internet and said, "Hi, I'm a browser. Give me your pages." Right? And they couldn't tell on the other side if it was or wasn't. Everywhere you go, you find this, right? You find the PC clones that were able to run Microsoft Office. You find Microsoft Office clones that are binary compatible, like Wine. You have all these re-implementations and implementations that just make the world go. Sometimes it's being done against the commercial interests of the firm that you're interoperating with, like Microsoft Office for the Mac and iWork. Sometimes it's just being done with a firm that no longer exists. So, you know, if you go to the Internet Archive, you can find emulators for video games and processor architectures that just don't exist anymore. The companies that made them don't exist anymore. The rights holders are nowhere to be seen, and just works, right? It just runs. And that was once the status quo. And it created a balance of power where firms that didn't want to play nice and adopt standards had to engage in costly and unpredictable guerrilla warfare with reverse engineers and other tactics of COMCOM. And that stayed their hand. It made them balance out the costs of locking in their customers against, or the benefits of locking in their customers against the costs of maintaining that lock-in in the face of other rivals who were working with their customers to undo those locks, because no customer wants to be locked in. And what happened was a creep of law and policy in the form of jurisprudence and new laws that were passed that over time created a minefield for interoperators, or maybe you could call it more like a thicket, because each of these policies, whether it's contract law and tortious interference claims, or patent law, or anti-circumvention in the Digital Millennium Copyright Act, or the clauses of the Computer Fraud and Abuse Act that relate to terms of service, each of these has some kind of escape valve, right? That's supposed to protect competition, the public interest. But if you line them up, you can say, all right, well, trademark has got this escape valve in nominative use, but you can block that with copyright. And then copyright has fair use, but you can block that with patent. And you can arrange them so that you can build an airtight bubble around your firm. The thing that stops you from building a thing that plugs into Facebook and lets you leave Facebook while still maintaining contact with the people who matter to you there is not the technological challenges of it. It's the fact that Facebook will reduce you to radioactive rubble if you tried in the courts, right? And it's why you can't just talk about this as a technological problem. It's why law and policy and the power dynamics that determine law and policy all have to be considered in the round, because there is another flywheel here. Supernormal profits, regulatory capture, policies that favor the firms, more supernormal profits. And that's the other flywheel that we've got to figure out how to break.
Which we have limited time on. And so, Rebecca, I want to come to you on one of the other solutions that you suggest in the book, which is transparency, right? Access to information. You know, you briefly mentioned that Amazon in its early days trying to get into the content space at one point required creators to not criticize Amazon, but then there was pushback and they had to pull that provision, which suggests something of which was a pushback coming from creators, right? And so there is something to the idea of knowing what's happening and therefore being able to react to it. And yet, and yet we don't see as much of that as one might think, given the really outrageous behavior that you lay out in the book. Now, maybe you need to read the book to find 4.5 million% returns on investments and say, that sounds good to me. But what do you do with transparency, to put it directly, if people don't care?
My favorite story that shows the the potential of that is around the Audible Gate scandal, where I know we've got very limited time, so I'll just do the real shorthand version, but you should read the book. The story is wild. But basically, Audible, owned by Amazon, was doing this con where they were encouraging subscribers to return their audiobooks, you know, which is a really great way, like keep reusing their credit. Even if they'd loved the book, they'd listen to the whole thing and maybe they'd bought it 6 months earlier. And then clawing back the full amount of the royalties from the authors themselves. And they hid this by just reporting net sales that didn't include returns. And authors only found, they suspected something was up, their royalty patterns were getting weird, but they didn't know until there was a data glitch that suddenly showed 3 weeks of returns in a single day, right? And so that lifted the veil. You cannot fight an enemy if you don't know what they look like, or at least it's very, very difficult. And so that's what allowed them to mobilize in a campaign called #AudibleGate, if you want to look at that, led by an amazing activist and author called Susan May. And so we see from that story the potential of transparency to make a difference. And I talked before about how we do look at other countries in terms of inspiration for what we can do about some of these things. One of the great things that's in the European Digital Single Market Directive is they've got mandates for, you know, creators to have, you know, entitlements to fair and proportionate remuneration, to get their copyrights back when they're no longer being commercially exploited, but also to have transparency over how their works are being used, what revenues are coming in, and how they're getting paid. And so,
to whom is the transparency directed, though? I mean, because again, I mean, if I'm just happy, you know, to just go along with this, you could tell me all the kinds of terrible things that are happening. I'll say, well, you know, whatever. So is there a particular target audience for transparency beyond just the diffuse public?
So like we saw that campaign that resulted from that knowledge about what was going on, you know, it was hugely mobilizing, right? The authors were able to organize and to work together, and they actually even Amazon Audible, which is one of the most secretive companies in the world, refuses to kind of share anything about anything, and they had to change their policies, right? They got rid of these super restrictive 7-year lock-ins on authors who'd supplied books. They also had to transform the way that they reported on sales and returns, right? And like, there's still a lot of work to be done. We need a lot more reform, but that was achieved because of the transparency. But I should say as well, like when we talked about the special characteristics of monopsony and how it's more dangerous than monopoly, one of the other reasons for that is that traditional antitrust remedies, which are to break companies up or get them to pinky swear to do the right thing, work particularly poorly in the context of excess buyer power. But what we know does work are interventions that, you know, widen those choke points out, that encourage new entrants, that directly regulate their buyer power, or that help build countervailing producer power. And so those are all the interventions we're talking about in the book, whether it's reforming the rules around DRM, or whether it's introducing transparency mandates, whether it's putting those time limits on copyright contracts. They're all aimed at doing those things so that we widen these choke points out and give, you know, creative workers and suppliers a better chance at holding on to some more of the value of their work.
So let me ask 2 more quick questions before we close. Podcasting. is podcasting doomed? Right. I'm not asking you to predict the future, right? You point out in the book that podcasting, right, is one of the last places where you don't see these choke points. Are we at the point now in late September 2022 where we can, from that perspective, save podcasting from going the same route as all the other industries you mentioned?
We could. It remains to be seen whether we do, but I think that companies like Spotify are desperately trying to roll up podcasting and stick it inside walled gardens. It was designed by Aaron Swartz and Dave Weiner and Ben Hammersley to be an open, difficult to contain protocol, a federated protocol. But as we've seen with the web, it is possible to take these big open spaces and enclose them. You know, as Tom Eastman says, I'm old enough to remember when the web wasn't just 5 giant websites filled with screenshots of text from the other 4. It didn't happen by accident. It was a policy choice that we let it happen.
And so
what we're seeing with podcasting right now is what we've been talking about in all of these other industries playing out in real time. And the question is, we know what's going to happen. Are we still going to permit it? And we have the answer.
So yes, and I certainly, as someone who does radio and podcasting, I agree. So last question. This is it. I'll ask each of you. Assuming that listeners buy your critique, what is the most important thing that an individual could do to help achieve the results that we're seeking here in terms of eliminating the choke points? One suggestion.
Nothing, because this is not a problem with an individual solution. Yeah. You're not going to recycle your way out of climate change. You're not going to shop your way out of monopoly. These are collective problems with big systemic solutions. And so that means that as an individual, you have to start thinking as like you're part of a group. You have to join a political party. You have to join a guild or a union. You have to get involved in big organized movements. Because the greatest lie we were told over the last 40 years is if there's a problem and you can't solve it on your own, it just can't be solved.
But keep buying on Amazon, or that's just up to you?
Look, Zephyr Teachout says that if you're going to a protest march to march against Amazon's working conditions, and instead of like just buying a marker on Amazon to make your protest sign, you drive around for 3 hours looking for a guy in a leather apron who makes his own magic markers, you're not going to do much good for fighting Amazon.
Fair enough. Rebecca?
Yeah, absolutely. If we're going to fix this, we're going to have to do it together, right? We need to have the energy to do that. You know, feeling paralyzed and guilty because you've had to use these companies is just such a waste of energy that should be going to defeat the actual problem.
Well, then we are absolved. Enjoy your.
You got marching orders, though. You're absolved, and you got marching orders.
Yeah, there's work to be done. Come on, solidarity, baby.
Yes, there we go. Rebecca Giblin and Cory Doctorow, authors of the new book from Beacon Press, Choke Point Capitalism: How Big Tech and Big Content Capture Creative Labor Markets and How we'll Win Them Back. Incredibly timely, very important work. Thank you for joining me today on Hearsay Culture and KZSU.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
See you, Dave.
Take care.
All right. Now you want to